maybe it's for some of your listeners who haven't been in a lot of like entrepreneurial circles yet, this is worth saying. I have found many, many communities and lots of coaches who weren't academics super useful and super helpful. They've been wonderful and talk about a breath of fresh air, right? However, at a point, I became very aware of the fact that I was still an academic and that academic identity was really important to my business. And I was like, how? Who am I going to work with on that? Like, who is going to understand this? Because so many academics, so many have left. But as you know, I mean, in the last 5 years, the last 2, 3 years, it's just exploded. And unfortunately, oftentimes without, people having the choice to leave academia, that doors have just shut. I do think this is something unique about what you offer, both in BAE and studio, because they're not just for people who want to edit, but they're academic entrepreneurs. I think that's what you call it, academic entrepreneur studio. That's a hard thing to find.
Welcome to Leaving Academia, Becoming a Freelance Editor, the podcast. I'm your host, Paulina Cossette. In 2019, I was a political science professor who was fed up with the stress and hostility of academia, not to mention the low pay. I left my tenure-track job and went from barely surviving to thriving as a freelance academic editor. Today, I own Acadia Editing Services, an editing and coaching business that brings in 6 figures a year. In this podcast, I'll discuss the challenges of academia, what academic editing involves, and what life as a freelancer looks like. If you're willing to jump outside your comfort zone, it is possible to find joy, true flexibility, and a profitable and rewarding career as an academic editor. Thanks for listening. Welcome to Leaving Academia, Becoming a Freelance Editor. I'm your host, Paulina Cossette. With me today is the lovely and talented Kelly Merritt. Kelly is a former professor who lives from the US, but lives in Switzerland, which I've seen photos that you've sent me, Kelly. It's beautiful. I'm very jealous. And her business is called Define Your Lines. And Kelly works with teachers, students, and writers to help them create a sustainable writing practice and just enjoy their work and their schooling and their writing so much more. So welcome to the podcast, Kelly.
Thank you for Paulina. It's nice to be here.
So let's start at the beginning. Tell us, what did you do in academia?
Yeah, so I'm a PhD in education. In education, my specialty was in the philosophy of education. So I was pitching and writing and researching to a lot of abstract, lofty ideas. My research was incredibly conceptual. And even at times, I liked to play with the performative. But that was always kind of boundary stretching for me. Since I entered academia, that was something that I was interested in, is critical and then past the critical in trying to stretch the boundaries of my field. When you're in education, you also have a subject area that you're an expertise in. And so English education is my subject area expertise. I'm a certified secondary English language arts teacher, and I spent a lot of time thinking about how to help embrace language diversity. So whether that be dialects and language variation in the classroom or EAL students who are integrating and navigating our systems, how to do that. So that's, in a nutshell, what I was doing as a formal grad student, preparing pre-service teachers and writing in the philosophy of education.
And tell us about your journey from grad school into teaching and how you got the idea to start your business.
This is a great story. So, as an education PhD, you have some options to be tenure track relevant that are different than other fields. Strangely enough, and this is all about, I think, all of the oddities that happen in academia. When I decided to leave, I was actually in my 3rd year. I was finishing up comps, and my husband was also a PhD candidate at the same time, a couple of years ahead of me in science education. And it was 2009. So the economic crisis had just happened. Here we were, 2 full-time and fully funded grad students, which was great. And Michigan State University, massive teacher ed program, really well funded, super well respected. We had an amazing experience there. Like I really feel fortunate because unlike so many people's very real experiences, my experience in graduate school and the people I was surrounded by was pretty incredible, to say the least. I actually got a note from the dean of the school and said, given the cutbacks and the changes in the department, it's very possible we're not going to be able to extend funding past third year any longer. If that's the case for you, what would you do instead? And I remember this so clearly of like all the options she was listing. And my husband and I had both been now in graduate school for 3, him almost 5 years. We had some more that we wanted to finish. And I was like, I would return to full-time work. It was like click on the button. And I think in that moment, just a lot of pieces came together for me. It had nothing to do with wanting to leave. I loved it. I loved what I was doing. And I had every intention of returning to pursue a tenure track position. But I had the option at this point to go into secondary schooling as a professor or as a teacher education PhD. And if I continued to write and publish and stay relevant in the field, apply for tenure track jobs. That wasn't true for friends of mine, for instance, who wanted to work in community colleges. That, makes no sense, but that was the reality at the time. So my husband and I kind of looked at each other. We knew people at the school that we worked with here in Switzerland previously, which was a private international school, super multilingual, super cultural. We thought this might be a really good opportunity to consider going back to work, me, while my husband finished, and then we would switch roles for a little bit. We did not want to navigate the dual spousal hire situation in the United States. We didn't want to be in 2 different cities, which was very real at the time. And needless to say, we've had multiple opportunities to revisit that decision, even with considering moves back to the US. And Switzerland's always come out on top. And while it was really difficult because we had both the interest in returning to the university life and being closer to family, we've made the right decision in doing what we did. That we are both definitely sure of. So that's exactly what we did. I connected with someone that we knew here. I came over, and it also was really convenient because continental philosophy was really driving my philosophizing of pedagogy at the time. And so we kind of landed in a place that put me front and center with the topic of my research, the place where the philosophy was ripe for maturing my research at that particular time. And then I'll just kind of cut to the other part of the story, which is, we both eventually were going back and forth between full-time positions at the school and completing our degrees. The job market was just getting worse and worse and worse. So this was the era of the professor is in and Jen Polk and everybody talking about alt-ac and post-ac. And we just kind of kept looking at each other and comparing the benefits of going back for a position in the US or staying here. And after many of those decisions, we decided to stay. In 2017, the exact year, we had a massive administration change at our school. And that administration change was the beginning of something that I still today have a difficulty really characterizing. But I do think it's very fair to say it's equivalent to the kinds of stories that you're hearing come out of academia and why people are leaving. It became very toxic. It became very top down. I sat in on meetings of teachers who were literally martyred for the sake of covering up incompetency on the behalf of administrators. After one particular meeting, I remember being in my classroom the next day or two. I started crying. And my husband's like, "Why are you crying?" And I'm like, "I'm so embarrassed to be here. I'm so embarrassed to be here." It was no longer a place that aligned at all. Not just with who I was and what I believed in as a researcher, but I think being a researcher in education and a teacher, I've always felt like the ethics are a little bit different, right? It's one thing to be corporate and to have the standards and the ethics that are required in that space. But you can't assume, for instance, that those ethics are also the right ethics in an educational context where you claim to be taking on the parental responsibilities of children, for instance. So this began a very long, long period for me of figuring out what's going to be my plan B, because I really didn't feel like that place was going to be a sustainable place to stay. And sure enough, they showed me again and again and again that that was the case. So I started working on the idea of a business. I started writing relentlessly around the idea. I actually, after COVID, just before COVID and after COVID, I went through a pretty significant health crisis, but I was fortunately feeling well enough through it that I was actually finally able to sit down and start building infrastructure of what this business might be. If I could do anything in the world, right, with my expertise in education, what would it be? And this is what really kind of came to the surface. So I think the last thing I'll say around that is that there was a very protracted release from my academic identity because coming to a secondary school to pursue my research, I even had research releases here, made that long. But then secondarily, I realized I was going to have to let go of that place because it was no longer the school that I thought it was anymore. But it offered me a pretty fat insurance policy financially and with benefits and all those things that come with it in Switzerland. And finally, gosh, it was like a year ago, December, after I already had a website, an initial build out of my business, that the last piece, the financial piece of working at a school also didn't make it worth my while anymore. And I was like, okay, bye-bye, I'm out. And so I'm full time now. And I think I said the other night to a colleague of ours in the studio, I'm like, I don't have any choice but to work hard on this now. This is my full-time job. So that's how I'm thinking about my business at this point.
So I described you as a former professor, but it sounds like you finished your degree while you were teaching at the school in Switzerland.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
And I started to, so I could have gone for an education position, but I really was committed to the humanities side of things, whether it be English or it be philosophy. And when I started to compare liberal arts positions, right, in large or small schools with a humanities driven school where I was in this location, it was also better financially for me to stay. So yeah, I never actually applied for a position or even sought that academic realm because of what it would have meant for my work. Honestly, the censorship probably of my work, but then also for my husband and I.
I think given the number of people in our BAE program who live abroad, we could do a whole episode on what it's like to move abroad. Actually, as I think about it, that might be kind of interesting to have a few of you on and talk about that, as so many of us still in the US are considering a move like that. But, there's some stuff that you said that I want to highlight. And the first, I think, that's really interesting is that you said you were seeing a lot of the same problems that we talk about in academia: the burnout, the abuse, the toxic work environment, the poor decision making. You see that going on in a secondary school, essentially a what is it, just high school there,
Oh,
or
we're
K through
K
12
through
basically.
postgrad. Hmm.
Yeah, so like a K through 12 type environment in Switzerland. So this isn't just a US problem. It's not just a higher ed problem. It's an educational system problem. And we know, I mean, I know that to be true because I hear from people all over the world, specifically who are in higher ed, because that's the audience that I target. But people all over the world are struggling with budget cuts to higher ed and all of that. And I think the other point that you made that was really interesting is what you said about the ethics of being an educator at whatever, no matter what level you're on, that we sort of hold ourselves to a higher standard, that we are imparting knowledge, we are sharing knowledge, we are guiding young people, whether they're children is especially important, but even young adults. And the other thing I would add is that, the institutions themselves always tell us this, that we have to put forth this extra effort and, be so generous with our time, even if we're not being compensated for all that extra work, because we have this mission. We are a mission driven institution. And yet, when the tables are turned and they are supposed to turn around and take care of us, that support is not there, or there is abuse, or there is a toxic environment, or, all these horrible stories that we hear. So that's really something interesting to think about, that the administration of educational institutions is not meeting the ethical standards that it probably should. And I like that contrast you made that, it's not a corporation that's profit driven and it really should be held to a higher standard.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on something it's really important when we think about the work of education, to think about the fact that many institutions, private institutions, for instance, do have to make a living, right? Universities, they have to stay afloat. But if we're going to make these claims to higher care of the self, if we're going to make the claims to a greater moral standard, if we're going to be claiming to, I don't know, be the guiding light in the Western world, right? You yourself have created a higher ethical standard. I'm very, I don't want to say, I really like to trouble and complicate the kind of standard narrative of education being the savior of the world, right? It's not progressive, it's not linear. I tend now to make a very broad daylight distinction between school and education because I think school, and this gets to your point about K through university, right? It is evolving into a whole nother kind of entity. And we can't use the same narrative about ethics and education if we're going to let education become so less a part of what school is. So this is an area that I spent a lot of time thinking about. And I've had the benefit, I think, of watching it K through 12 and then also through the university system. I'm really happy that we are coming to grips, I think, and just facing the reality. I mean, let's be honest. I'll call it the golden age of the professoriate. So, like, right, my father-in-law, he went through as an emeritus. Like, he had an amazing experience. But all the people who went through with him, are also experiencing things that we weren't talking about at that time. And now we're talking about, like the fact that, they didn't have a lot of responsibilities at home. Somebody else was taking care of all of that, right? The funding was particularly skewed in the direction of the sciences and men. And now people are finally talking about that. So we're paying the cost, for becoming aware of these things. But I think what we're also seeing is this proliferation in the education space and figuring out how we can be ethical again in our educational work and how that may or may not be tied to what school is at all.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. I think there that difference between schooling versus education. Obviously, school does not have a monopoly on the ability to educate people. And I think that for a lot of academics who are struggling with the idea of leaving, they identify or they have this identity as an educator, and they think if I am not in my institution, then that means I'm no longer an educator. But that is absolutely not true, right? If we can access education outside of traditional institutions, that means that educators can operate and be paid outside of traditional institutions, which, as you know, is a personal mission of mine, is to show people that you can continue to do all the things that you love to do, whether it's writing or editing or public speaking or teaching or whatever. You can do it outside of your institution and get paid perhaps even better than you were, certainly with better working conditions.
And
So,
you bring up another narrative, right? So there's the narrative of what education is supposed to do in society, but that narrative of what you should be doing as an educator, I think is a really important one for all of us to just like step back on and continually reassess because it is something that people do because they love. And if they didn't start by loving it, they oftentimes fall in love with some aspect of it, right? But it doesn't mean that we have to sacrifice ourselves at the altar of other people's ideas of what that should be. And that's where that weird space of like the corporate whatever, or just frankly, other people having their paws in what shouldn't be, any of their business. When the administration changed at my school, like I was mentioning, that was probably the most profound 7 years for me of learning the exact boundaries that you're speaking of. I really had to figure out, was I going to stay there? If I was going to stay there, I needed to know clearly and ethically for myself how I could stay there, right? And what roles I might play. So, for instance, I ended up stepping out of my leadership roles and attempting to enact the leadership that I felt like was needed at a more grassroots level because it just wasn't bumping up against the mandates so often of the school administration. What you do now, I think it's so powerful. You're making me realize that it's not just because we oftentimes talk about how we can translate our skills, for instance, and use them in other parts of industry. I think what you've just made an argument for is how, as educators, we also aren't any less, right? Those skills, we might even call them other things, but you actually might be behaving more like the educator you always wanted to be in this business or in this editing work because you finally have sort of set yourself free from the cage of all those external demands that were just stifling you for a long time.
Yeah, the true academic freedom. When academic freedom is being destroyed, at least here in the US. I just saw an article this morning about Florida is now telling sociology professors not just what classes they can teach, but what content they can teach in those classes and what content they can't teach. So yeah, it's like you get to live that vision of being an educator, however you see that looking, which you went into academia thinking you would be able to do that, and of course you can't. And this having your own business gives you the freedom to do that.
I saw that same article yesterday, and I was like, oh gosh, I was worried about, the era that I was leaving, everything was moving to grants. Well, as a philosopher in education, like grant writing isn't really the first thing that you think of as being relevant to your career. And I'm like, I just don't want to be censored or directed in that way. I saw that yesterday. I was like, gosh, I the writing would have been on the wall for at least as many years in academia as it is was for me being teaching in a K through 12 school.
Yeah, I think it was in Inside Higher Ed, and I'll link to that article in the show notes for anybody who's curious about it. But so tell us about your business now. So you said you left your teaching position a year ago in December, and I know that from working with you that your business has evolved a bit. So tell us, where did you start with a business and what led you to make those changes over the last year or so to arrive where you are today?
It is such a twisting, turning journey. I know you know this better than I because you're much further down the path. But yeah, so I originally went with the business name and brand name, A More Than Education. And a more than is hyphenated, more than it comes right out of my research. And this idea that we kind of attend to all the things that schools typically overlook. We let those things into the educational experience. So I did the brand design, I did the web development, picked up social handles, et cetera, et cetera. Along this path, I was actually already now getting in contact with a lot of different communities. And I'll just say, because I think now is a good time to like start pitching that. When people are thinking about spending money, that's a very real consideration. But probably one of the biggest things that I've learned throughout my process is how invaluable community is. And this is hard for us in our, areas of expertise, is like letting other people with other areas of expertise just let their expertise shine through. Like, I obviously don't have truckloads of cash to throw at this, but when I find someone who can really deliver on their stuff and provide great value for a price that I can afford, I just can't emphasize how important that has been to my experience. So I got probably 6 months out from having launched that first website with A More Than Education. And I was, as an expat, you're right, we could do a whole other show because there's this whole other filter of what are the other considerations that I need to take into effect. And you're always kind of hyper aware that you're an expat. And I was like, I really just want to double check, cross my T's, dot my I's, and make sure I've got my legal stuff sorted, especially since I'm going to be working with minors. And so I reached out to this brilliant woman here who works in the EU and in Switzerland and internationally. And this was the audience I was going to be working with. And when I started that legal alignment process, so my website policies needed to be legally aligned, not just for me in Switzerland, but for the people in the other countries that I intended to work with, as well as my contracts Then she started one day just kind of saying, "So, your name, let me do a little bit more digging. Do you plan to do a trademark? Do you plan to, X, Y, and Z this?" I'm like, "Yeah, that's the long-term goal." Sure enough, and I was already aware of this. There was one school in the UK that's a trauma-informed school that had used kind of a nickname version of my name. So instead of A more than education, they were the short version, more than ed. And the problem was that they were a school. We were in the same industry. I thought, hey, they're in the UK, no problem. Hey, they do a different kind of educational service. They're a school, and I'm coaching, working with kids one-on-one in small cohorts. But especially from a trademarking and even from a web perspective, they could come to me and give me a cease and desist, right? Because there's infringement there on the name. They never showed any interest in doing that. Additionally, and this ended up being the bigger argument for me to pursue a brand refinement, was that it was just going to always be an uphill battle with my SEO. I was constantly going to be battling for those words, those phrases in that space. And I just decided, she said, now's the time to make a refinement if you want to, because you're always going to lose a few customers. You're always going to lose a little bit of traction if you do the refinement later. So here I was 6 months after having like the first launch, and I was like, all right, time to do a brand refinement. Enter Pauline Cossette. So in about that same time, I was seeing that that work needed to happen. I was wanting to grow the marketing side of my business. And I was kind of playing, I knew I wanted to add one more persona. And I was like, should this be educational institutions? Should this be blah, blah, blah? And I think it was literally your mapping PDF that came around. And the writer's piece just like smacked me in the face because I was already doing this work. I just hadn't identified it as a writer's persona. And then I saw what you were doing with marketing. Then I saw the possibility in BAE to really get into the systems and flow construction of my website. And I was like, okay, if I get this accelerator package, which was the Boxer, right? And I'm working through this piece, it'll be the final component of my three personas in my website. And I'll be working on the brand refinement with my other groups in the background. And so I signed up for BAE. And that coaching that you give everywhere that you go and you give amply. I mean, truly, when I listened to your ROI, your return on investment podcast episode, I think I remember voxing you afterwards. I'm like, that was ROI. You give me ROI. But you were so generous to this day. Like I really think that each time I had a question or I was wondering something that I had been wondering for a long time, to have the Voxer option and just spit it out in 5 minutes of talking and see how it landed with someone else that could say, nope, think about this differently. Or, yeah, that's an important point you need to consider. Or, what about you move in this direction? Like it, because of my marketing, I think sometimes about the knots we work ourselves into in our heads. And it just helped me loosen the knots. It helped me untangle all those parts and pieces. So by the end of BAE, I was committed to having writers as my third persona. I had been working through all of the legal alignment that had started in the summer, but this was the part that felt really ultra satisfying to me. I had landed on my brand refined name, which was Define Your Lines. And it was really powerful that I was able to arrive at something that not only grew out of my personas and my work, but felt like a refinement of the work I was doing with a more than education and not a total overhaul. So even in my visual refinement that I'm now finished with and is on my website, it looks a lot like where I had started, but with really key features that target the define your lines. I switched my URL. I have all new social channels, but I kept a more than education as my background business name. So it was kind of the best of both worlds for me.
I think what stands out to me about your journey there is, you started out, you had this idea, you moved forward with it, and for a more than education. And you realized, oh crap, I've got to make some changes. But you didn't let that stop you. You know, you kept pushing. You took a problem solving attitude and said, okay, how can we rework this? You know, and you kept all in the background. And I know because we were working together then, you were still pursuing clients. You were still having discovery calls. You were still thinking about who can I work with and how can I move this business forward as I'm reworking my website, as I'm reworking the branding. And I think a lot of people early in business feel like everything has to be perfect. And so they don't start, right? They don't share the website because it's not perfect. Or they feel like, you know, maybe they've shared their website, but then clients aren't immediately pouring in. And so they go back to the website and they just keep reworking it. And I'm over here as their coach going, just leave it alone, you know, like you can rework it, you can make small tweaks, but also be out there talking to people and advertising your business and marketing yourself. And so I mean, you are just such a hard worker, I know as well. You know, you're always thinking about this, you're always trying to take steps forward, which I think is absolutely crucial in business. You know, we cannot let our fears or our mistakes or whatever paralyze us. And so you did it, you know, and you spent the last 6 months or so reworking this brand. And finally, at the beginning of this year, I think was when you did the relaunch of Define or the launch of Define Your Lines. And it has worked, right? I think, you know, and so you're continuing. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is you have the true entrepreneurial spirit where you don't let little things stop you. You keep pushing, you keep reinventing yourself, you keep coming up with ideas of how to adapt. And that's what we have to do because the market is always changing. The world is unfortunately always changing. And if we are going to be successful in business, we can't let any of that change stop us. We have to move along with it.
You've a number of times brought up this conflict, I think, between experimentation and strategy. And I've actually had coaches, many of whom I'll say have never talked. Everyone's always afraid of the legal side, right? Because they're just like, it's going to be expensive to talk to a lawyer. Just wait until somebody creates a problem for you, then you can fix it. That was just going to be so much of a derailment and so expensive for me, it wasn't worth that any longer. But when I would hear coaches, actually, I'd say to them, and these were people that came out of business, I'd use the word strategy because strategy was always really important to me. It set up such glaring red flags for them. They were like, you're in over-analysis paralysis. You're not gonna make any changes. You're not gonna experiment if you think in terms of proceeding with strategy. And so I'm really grateful for all of the people, and you included, of continuing to say, just put it out there, just put something out there. A website, like, so, excuse my French, but in English we say your first shitty draft. Like, right, once you get the first shitty draft out, like you realize you're like 60% at least there, maybe further, right? Because it's so painful getting over the hump of that part of the process. And so I need to keep hearing that. And that's another value that comes from working with a coach. And it's another value that comes from being in community. Is like you all can together just be like, this is really ugly. Please no one comment on it, but I'm just going to post it. Right. And of course, everyone's like, this is amazing, or parts of it are amazing, or whatever the case is. It's still, I think that's a big part of the work. I think always balancing between strategy and experimentation. So I do approach this like a writer. This is where I get my cues in my own process of sustainability is what can I put kind of on a slow burn? When can I just get the first shitty draft of it out there? Like the website, even though I had amazing people working on it and doing great stuff, it was a start. And I think particularly important for business is like I didn't feel like until I had that website up, like I didn't have a storefront. My legal analyst, she has a joke on one of her posts on Instagram, and she was like, "You're an online business, but you don't have a website." And she's like, "Girl, you got a hobby, you know?" And for me, that was true.
It
Now,
is, yeah. I mean, I always say to you guys in BAE that your website is your home on the internet, and it's absolutely true. Like you have, I mean, should you not seek out clients until you have the website? No, of course. Like I think that's what we're both getting at here is that you can do all the things in parallel at the same time. You can be working on the website while you're also communicating with people in your network and saying, "Hey, I'm doing this thing. Can you let me know if you know of anyone who wants this?" But you do it all together. And yeah, I do think it's crucial because as I always say to you all, like people are going to check you out. They're going to see a post on Instagram or on LinkedIn and they're going to want to dig deeper and see who is this person? Are they legitimate? Are they some rando, who's just posting on the internet? And you really have to have something. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be. And I think the storefront is an even better analogy, to say, like, this is who I am. This is my business. I am real.
I think for a lot of people, the launch is really important. It's like an important date. It's kind of a landmark for them. For me, the concept of a soft launch made all of that possible, right? Because I was just like, okay, it'll get out there at some point. But at some level, even before I had a website out, I was doing so much of the work, like you said, of communicating with potential clients. Another piece of great advice that I got was that low-hanging fruit, right? I wanted to start with educators, but they were like, what's your low-hanging fruit in terms of ensuring that you have some slow, steady income coming in? And that was students. And so I totally adjusted in that moment and started doing that kind of like local marketing, right? While the website was being built, while all these other things were happening. And that made it possible, quite frankly, for me to be able to continue funding the infrastructure building of the business. So there's the strategy and the experimentation. And I think the strategy is vital. Like for me, I need to know, as you know well, the whys, right? So I'm always asking you, Paulina, why am I doing this? How is it connecting to my customer journey? How is it connecting to this? How is it connecting to that? Because I can't explain it to my clients. It's harder for me to represent myself as a business if I don't understand why I'm doing it. But while there's that balance between strategy and experimentation, there's also this balance, I think, between marketing and just getting some clients and building the business in the background. And I have to say, I'm amazed at this point, and when I look ahead now at the next 6 months, of how many resources I will have put into my website. I really didn't expect that. But I think to get it to a point where it's actually working for me, that's been required. Also to protect me and to protect my clients, right? So all the stuff that goes behind it. But I'll get totally bogged down. Like even in the last 6 weeks, I've been really deep in the cave of just cranking out some of the infrastructure building. And I need to come out of the cave and meet with clients. Like I need to like send an email that has flashy promo materials on it because that's when I actually feel the most like myself and the person and the project and the business that I'm trying to sell. So and that's a really difficult balance, I think, to navigate, but it's been a really important one for the sustainability of the experience.
Yeah, I love that distinction that you're making. I mean, essentially, what you're saying is there's the client-facing work that is the services that we provide, which is the reason we all go into this, right? Because we love doing that teaching, editing, instruction, whatever it is we're doing. And then there's the work on the business itself, which I think, the more that we grow our businesses, the work on the business itself starts to take up more and more time. And for me, that's so much time that is spent drafting emails, creating email funnels, like trying to sell a course or a program. It involves so much more marketing than just a service-based business where you're trying to land editing clients or coaching clients or something. And it does, you're absolutely right. It feels like being in a cave. And I think what has helped me so much, and it sounds like this has also helped you, is being in a community where you have a meeting every week or every other week with your group to talk about it, right? Like that Zoom call that we have in the studio every 2 weeks, and our Voxer chat is a a way to come out of the cave and force yourself out into the real world again, as well as just having space to like to complain and to whine and to say, I'm so confused, I don't know how to sort through this, or hey, I just landed this really great client, let's celebrate it. And it's, yeah, it's been really wonderful. Let's talk about your business more. So define your lines. As you said, you have these three different audiences. And speaking of having to juggle so many things in business, you have sort of this unique challenge of speaking to, you know, teachers, to students, and to writers, all of which are connected, but still have these very unique needs as potential clients. So how have you been juggling that?
So, yeah, at a heart, I mean, and you know this about me, and I think this is probably true for a lot of people who have been at the university level too. While we might think of ourselves as researchers or educators, I do think there's something about us that really resonates with being an educator, right? And so I do realize that's a really different thing at the primary level than it is at the secondary level than it is at the university level. Like, there's no getting around that. But we're all educators. And whether we're trying to educate kids in a classroom, adults in a classroom, or we're trying to educate the readers of our writing, right? There's this burden we have of bringing people along with us. And so, with writers in particular, how do we bring people on a journey with us that's pedagogical? And that's a word we use in education to kind of get away from the transport model of education, right? We've got this thing, I'm going to put it in your head and get from point A to point B, and really kind of embrace how complicated a relationship of education is when we talk about pedagogy. But I like to think about how that translates into writing as well. The unfortunate thing I think about being a writer is that you so rarely get immediate feedback. It's one of the lovely things. You're in a classroom teaching and you say something and you like eyes roll back or kids get excited and raise their hands, and while that sucks and it's really stressful, it's also something to work with. Right. And so I think of our work as so performative because we're always affectively reading how people are taking in what we're doing. And boy, if that isn't true in business, it's not true anywhere. But as a writer, there's a delay, right? And so we have all these emotional management games that we go through at different stages of the writing process. So there's like the quality product that we want to complete at the end, and that's really important in and of itself. But that process of getting there requires a ton of work to sustain. And from being a professor, it's not like you can just push through one paper and it sucked and you got it published and it was great and you celebrated, but you have to do this for a living, right? And so is there a way to tweak your process? Is there a way to tweak the experience of having to show up and publish and publish and publish on whatever terms, quite frankly, whatever that final outcome needs to look like, that just works better for you? How can we align this more with your values? How can we align this more with your lifestyle? I mean, I had to learn that through my work as an educator in a school. But then when I had this health issue come up, I had to figure out again, okay, now how do I also integrate life, my personal life? You've talked about your family experience. Like, as we all get older, we have families who need care. We have spouses who need, like, we have children who need caring for. There's so much more that goes into a quality product than just getting it out the door. And so with writers in particular, helping them get untangled in the writing process to restore sustainability and joy to that is really where I'd love to meet people. I do developmental and copy edits, but I have to be totally honest and say I really love blending that with coaching. I just think there's so much to be gained from doing the personal work. And that doesn't have to mean that you make everything a big project, but helping people find the patterns in how they show up in their writing process, I think is one way to help us identify where we are when it gets overwhelming so that we know, okay, I'm about 60% through. I don't really know where this paper is going, but I know I'm a lot closer than I was last week, right? That helps me pace myself, make the project sustainable. With educators and with students, I also work a lot on writing, whether it's teaching, writing, right, in the classroom, creating curriculum around composition, or with students. It's like so overwhelming for the vast majority of students to understand what a teacher expects because like all these unspoken expectations about the essay or academic writing is all new to them. In secondary level is where it's all getting put upon them and oftentimes not explained well. So they're doing two things in that case. They're both demystifying the process of writing and trying to figure out if they remotely can relate to it or find it, interesting at any level. But that's happening in the broader context of making their way through school. So define your lines became really powerful for me when I realized, this isn't only about our written lines in a literal sense. It's about that figurative aspect, the journey, that we're all traveling in making sense of ourselves as writers and making sense of ourselves in the educational process. And I think the last thing I'll say on that at this point is just for with researchers and academic writers, we often kind of think about what we do in spite of what's happening around us at the university, right? But I think this is an important part to restoring sustainability in academic writers is realizing that as much as we're trying to protect ourselves from all the crap that's happening, this is our educational journey. This is a part of our journey through education. And so, how can our writing contribute rather than detract from what makes that a joyful experience for us?
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to hear you talk about the connections between the three different audiences because I think, what a lot of folks in BAE come to realize over the 12 weeks that we're together in the cohort is, maybe they start their journey thinking they want to be an academic copy editor or they want to go into developmental editing. But then over the course of the 12 weeks, spending time in this community, they start to really get in touch with their dreams and their desires and their passions and the things that really excite them that have been buried for perhaps years because they've spent all this time in academia pursuing what they were supposed to quote unquote pursue, the things that we should do as quote unquote good academics. And that personality and that humanity and that the hobbies and the interests and the curiosity and the passion has been buried. And I've had so many people tell me that they started painting again, or they started writing fiction again, or writing poetry or whatever. And through this process, I think what they really are realizing is that they're complex human beings and we can't just get joy from our job, from being a professor or being a grad student or whatever. We have to get joy in our lives from all kinds of different things. And so what I'm hearing you say is that you work with teachers, you work with students, you work with writers, but the thread that is tying all of these people together is that they are in fact complex human beings and they their educational journey needs to be treated as such, that they have different needs, that like you said with writers, they're not just writing a book, they want to have this goal of a sustainable writing practice, but it needs to fit into their very complex life with all their other responsibilities. Teachers love teaching, but they need to build habits and some kind of schedule or structure that allows them to love their teaching and still have time for everything else in their life. And students are not just blank slates that we tell them, here's how you write an essay. They have questions, they have curiosity, they want to be convinced that they should spend their time as rational beings on this activity. And so I love that you are able to see the complexity in all of these people and help them to achieve their goals. And I think that coming back to the folks in the program who have been interested in academic editing and say, fiction editing as well, there's been a lot of concern about, can I have a business that does these different things? Absolutely, right? Absolutely. You can serve different audiences. You just have to sort of find what is your mission? What is the thing that really drives you? And how does that thing connect? Or where do we find that thing in both of those groups? Whether it's developing a sustainable writing practice or whatever it might be, what is the thread that connects those different audiences, and how can you speak to that in your marketing?
Mhm. Yeah, I think this is something that studio and moving into that after BAE and the end of the first semester has made more apparent to me in my work with you. So I was also thinking very much about writers, about the kinds of academic and or other writers' audiences that I could work with, I wanted to pitch to, and that I really felt a connection with, right? So in terms of really figuring out that persona, it was perfect for that. But you also made very aware, and maybe it's for some of your listeners who haven't been in a lot of like entrepreneurial circles yet, this is worth saying. I have found many, many communities and lots of coaches who weren't academics super useful and super helpful. They've been wonderful and talk about a breath of fresh air, right? However, at a point, I became very aware of the fact that I was still an academic and that academic identity was really important to my business. And I was like, how? Who am I going to work with on that? Like, who is going to understand this? Because so many academics, so many have left. But as you know, I mean, in the last 5 years, the last 2, 3 years, it's just exploded. And unfortunately, oftentimes without, people having the choice to leave academia, that doors have just shut. I do think this is something unique about what you offer, both in BAE and Studio, because they're not just for people who want to edit, but they're academic entrepreneurs. I think that's what you call it, academic entrepreneur studio. That's a hard thing to find. And it's also hard to find, there's a lot of coaches who help people leave academia for another industry job. This I also found in K through 12 teaching, right? Here's how we can help you take your skills and translate them. But what if, and this is the space I'm trying to inhabit with educators in particular, and you've made me even more aware today of how this is equally true for university level educators as it is for, say, secondary, right? Just leaving in and of itself doesn't solve our problem. It gets rid of some of the toxic stuff, but we still have to figure out what we want to do. And so there's a number of amazing coaches who help figure that out. There's a number of amazing coaches who then pick up the ball and say, I definitely want to go to industry. Help me figure out how to do that. There's other people who are like, hey, I can help you continue using your incredible writing skills and editing skills, right? Come and join my program. One of the things I really want to do is inhabit this space before someone makes a decision, or even maybe they don't have to make a decision. They stay in their current job and they say, this isn't feeling sustainable or all that joyful, right? Help me hold space for that in spite of whatever else is going on for me. At some point, I might decide to pursue another job. At some point, I might decide I have to pursue another job. Maybe I've already left and I've been working in informal education for a while. But I think this is making me think of how important it is to honor ourselves, and maybe even more so as higher ed educators. High school teachers have been hearing for a while now, it's okay to be a little emotional when you're a high school educator, even though you're as much of a martyr as a professor is. But once you get to be a professor, you use that word bury. And we have to. We have to do it to survive. We think we have to do it in order to make tenure, in order to get to the next step on that track, right? But when that's buried, right, it also means that you're not fueling the fire that keeps you there. And so all of this is to say that doesn't mean that you should stay or that you should go, right? But it certainly means that we need to pay attention to what's buried.
Mm, I love that so much. It's absolutely an emotional process, right? Where you've spent all that time burying everything, hiding your feelings, even from yourself, thinking, oh, I just have to stick it out until I get tenure and everything will be fine. And when I started the program, I thought that most people who would enroll would be junior faculty who were just completely burned out from trying to get tenure. And what I realized or what I learned is it's actually people who have been teaching for a long time who have gotten tenure and they realize that it's not everything they were told. It's not what they thought it was cracked up to be. And it's almost like you bury the all those human complex parts of yourself to achieve this goal. And then you think, finally, I'm free. I get to do whatever I want now. And you realize that academia is not going to meet those needs that you have, the desire for creativity, to paint, to write, to play music, to whatever. And yeah, so I mean, we see that a lot in the community, people that are just sort of grieving the time that they've lost. They're grieving the loss of the career that they loved, that they thought they were going to spend their entire life in. And I think one of the things I am most proud of is that we have this community as a space to share those feelings and to not feel shamed or judged for wanting more, right? To realize that you are meant to do more, that you deserve to do more and have more.
I think the story that you've shared a number of times of your own, it goes a long way in connecting for people in that regard, but also in drawing them out, all right? This evocative work that we oftentimes don't associate with the work we do in academia. It's more delivery of information or arguing for information. This evocation of who we are and our connections to it and our feelings around it and our emotions around it can really feel missing, and particularly right now. Particularly right now. But yeah, the community is invaluable for that because it in your community in particular, this is something that's unique from your community compared to others that I've participated in, is that even if you do BAE and you finish and you don't enroll in something else right away, you stay a part of the community. That's like happened in maybe 1% of communities I've participated in. So I think that is already another example of massive return on investment for people. You can come back anytime. But I also love the work that you're doing to nurture and cultivate a space that acknowledges how long and complicated this journey is. If you're, we talk about emerging from a cave as part of the business building. Like, what is it exactly that professors like yourself emerged from when they left? I mean, that's going to take more than 6 months. It's going to take more than a course, right? And a lot of people look for you to continue to buy in. And I think that I give you credit for that, not just because of the value that it returns, but I think it's an imperative part of healing from the process and like pivoting to a productive way to continue sharing your talents with people and feeling, not just being productive. We are productive, but what you're getting at is how complicated it is to feel like we're being productive when we make the shift out of academia into another context.
Yeah, that's something that I have debated over and over again is, I offer this essentially a 12-week program at a price point that I try to keep affordable for most people. And I've thought about changing it to like a 1-year program because really when you're starting a business, you're not going to get from zero to full client roster in 12 weeks. That's just not realistic. And that's not the purpose of the course, right? It's becoming an academic editor or coach. It's how do we lay the foundation? How do we land your first few clients and sort of set you down the road of growing the business? And I keep it at 12 weeks because I want it to still be affordable for people who are not sure. Like a lot of people come in and they're just thinking, maybe this is for me. Maybe I'll get started now, but I can't leave academia for another few years because I'm almost going to hit retirement or I have kids who are getting the tuition benefit or whatever.
Mhm.
And so it allows them to at least start and take that first step. And then, like you said, yeah, you get lifetime access to the Slack channel and the course itself and any updates that we have. And so you can come back right? If you maybe you stall because you have a really busy semester or year teaching, you can still pop into Slack anytime you want and get started again or ask questions or whatever. And then, as you've mentioned, we have the Academic Entrepreneurs Studio, which is a 6-month small group mastermind for folks who are ready to supercharge their business, who are like you, who are ready to be full-time, who are full-time and wanting to take in as many clients as they can and really build those systems to have those in place so that they're not going to burn out, from trying to do all the things. So
Mhm.
yeah, I've considered changing it to like a 1-year program, but I think that would just be cost prohibitive for a lot of people who are wanting to see if this is the right fit for them or not. So I appreciate you pointing that out.
You just talking around it, though, I think it shows us, it just demonstrates the insider knowledge that you have of this experience, right? And I can say something that I've learned again and again that I know you would say, yep, it takes a long time, right? Is how impatient we are. And I think also as academics who have achieved at a high level, getting a graduate degree alone, right, at a high level, you can do a lot. You know you're very capable, even if you're not comfortable flouting that. You know that you're capable of crunching through a lot. I will say that building a business is incredibly slower than you think. I'm still coming to terms with that. And I'm a really impatient person. So that's an even harder thing for me to come to terms with. But to your point about the fact that you remain there, right? I haven't skipped a beat if I take 6 months off of a service with Paulina because I've seen what's going on in the community, because I can go log in and catch up. And I just think that kind of continuity, but there's so much other stuff that's fragmented and uncertain when you're going through transitions like this, that continuity in and of itself is really valuable.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Well, this has been one of my favorite conversations that I've had on the podcast. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience and your knowledge. If anyone out there is interested in working with you, where should they go to get in touch?
I would love to talk with people. Define Your Lines is my URL, defineyourlines.com. It's also my handle on Instagram and Facebook. And I have one on LinkedIn, but you could also reach me on my personal page on LinkedIn, which is Kelly M. Merritt. My name has 2 L's, 2 R's, and 2 T's. I'm sure it will be in the show notes. Yeah, I'd love to connect with people, and more than even talking about services or sales, I'm really just curious about your journey and your experience and things that you have done to make that sustainable and joyful for yourself. Tomorrow, my lead magnet for writers is going to be up and running, and I've actually included a short self-discovery survey to kind of think about what I'm calling the 5 pillars of sustainability and joy in a writing practice. So even if you just take it to give me some feedback on it, I'd be most appreciative.
And we'll put the link to directly to that landing page for the survey in the show notes as
Oh,
well.
that'd be
So
great. Thank you. I'll
awesome.
just thank you. Thank you for being an amazing coach. Thank you for hosting BAE and the studio. And I appreciate you having me on. It's been
Oh,
a lovely conversation.
thanks, Kelly.
If you're unhappy in academia and you think you might be a good editor or writing coach, check out my course, Becoming an Academic Editor. This digital course is paired with a 12-week group coaching program to support you through your decision to leave academia or not, and to start building a profitable and rewarding academic editing business. Learn more by going to acadiaediting.com/become an editor. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time.